Brace yourself.
One of the most interesting directions that games have taken in recent years is creating games under historical context. Not necessarily games that just take place in a specific historical period, but games that use a moment in time to promote a specific artistic message. Games like This War of Mine and Valiant Hearts have taken this direction, letting their historical context shape many of their themes and design elements. They use their settings as a window into the struggles and emotive atmospheres of their eras, acting as both historical fiction and artistic game design. One recent game has performed this as well, but in a way that I've never seen in a game before. Welcome to Detention. Detention takes place in 1960s Taiwan, a culture under martial law. Two students, Wei and Ray, each awaken in their school in Taiwan, only to be trapped inside the building by a dangerous typhoon. Things begin to get strange as Wei finds Ray in their school's auditorium, as the player then changes control from Wei to Ray, with the latter awakening in a nightmarish version of the school. Throughout the game, the player discovers some gruesome scenes, one of which features Wei appearing dead and suspended from the stage rafters. The player must uncover what has happened to the school, while also evading the looming threats that wander its halls. Detention is advertised as a horror game. It begins, for lack of a better word, innocently enough, taking cues from many of the survival horror godfathers. There are a few jump scares scattered about the game, but Detention doesn't revel in such elementary tactics. Collecting items to solve puzzles, narrowly sneaking past enemies, and exploring the ruined landscape of the school. These types of mechanics are standard play for a survival horror game. Silent Hill is an obvious influence for Detention, whether it's the eerie designs of the creatures Ray encounters or the intricacy of the game's puzzles. Detention almost revels in its horror classicism, and doesn't do much to conquer that. Trapped in a claustrophobic mental climate, Ray is defenseless. The disturbing world she awakens in doesn't do anything to hide its gruesome atmosphere. Monsters are ethereal, moving with lurching and unnatural animations. Solving puzzles usually means taking some horrific action, whether it's examining a vanished student's belongings or gathering items from a corpse. Detention doesn't want the player to feel comfortable in its world, but what makes this so fascinating comes long after the initial shock subsides. About halfway through the game, Detention begins to stop making its unsettling atmosphere so obvious, and begins creating horror from something far more potent, the real world. Ray's reality is constructed from her collection of memories, some deriving from school drama, some from a fractured home life, and some from the military state that is put in place during the game's setting. Soon, puzzles stop being all about blood and gore, and instead pack on layers and layers of subtlety, while also making their solutions all the more symbolic. Ray's entire life is one packed with uneasiness, and when Detention uses these real-world elements as its game design, that's where the shock dissipates and looming horror begins to grow. This is why games based on real-world events tend to hold such weight, especially in the genre of survival horror, a field where overt emotional reactions are so common. Horror is one of the most expressive game genres because of this inherent drive to provoke reaction from the player. In fact, that's the reason that Let's Plays of horror games are so common. A shout or a scream is the player reacting to the horror on screen, and that can be entertaining. Detention doesn't have too many moments where the reaction is this impulsive, but it does provoke a reaction, reiterating that Ray's world is toxic not by monsters or ghouls, but by experiences and dangers that someone living in 1960s Taiwan would have to contend with, among other, even more personable trials. And when that connection between fiction and reality begins to wind together, things change. Silent Hill, for example, has routinely made its game design reflective of its character's psyche, and I'd argue that that's one of the series' most interesting qualities. The fiction is cultivated from reality. The emotions and stresses that any regular person could potentially experience power the connection between the player and the character, even if a person has no physical similarity to the character. By the last segment of its gameplay, Detention pulls the same trick as Silent Hill. It abandons the fictitious, whether it's the eerie monsters or the intricate puzzles. By the end of the game, there are no physical monsters to threaten you. The horror stems from relatable themes like tension between family members or a budding relationship that is considered socially unacceptable. By this point, the puzzles in Detention are more fleshed out and build upon its narrative themes, while the horror elevates itself to something more psychological and contemplative. This is a daring move, one that many other horror game developers, especially on the indie side, seem to ignore or mishandle. But Detention's drive to power its terror by real-world threats and anxieties holds so much more value than a typical jump scare can, and that drive carries Detention to a level few games of its type have attained. And Detention does this by building stress and oppression from its own world. Martial law forces people to abandon certain joys in favor of suffocating security. Family strain can make a child feel helpless and vulnerable. The feeling of losing someone you love destroys innocence and reveals your inner weakness. Detention uses these moments among many others to show a reality without assurance. And that's the operative word, reality. It's not a fantasy or a dream, it's a possibility. It's something that can, and in the case of Detention, has happened. And when something is that real, containing the fear and horror is so much more difficult. It has to be released. Detention is really a bait and switch. While its early moments show brooding, lurching monsters and a chilling, empty location, it derives its strongest moments of fear from neither. Detention's horror stems from a reality that can exist at any time, and even more frightening, a reality that existed at one point. Throughout its playthrough, it strips away the surreal and fantastic components of its design, and focuses on elements that are far more plausible in real life. Detention's world is so oppressive, and the research done to implement such a historical setting clearly took resolve. I applaud Red Candle Games for constructing an experience whose scariest moments don't have an enemy or jump scare in sight. In the indie scene, that's rare, rarer than anyone could know. Detention is a horror game, but in a vast sea of Slender clones and PT knockoffs, it stands alone. Casting away the safety of fantasy, it's a game that shows fear through the lens of history and reality, and that's why I recommend playing Detention.